Hello, folks. This is the March 5th issue of the ClusterAPI Node Bootstrapping Working Group. We have pretty low attendance this time. We skipped last time because no one popped up. I see Mike joined, and I just heard that Matthew will join in a second. So let's get this started. Please keep in mind, we are a working group for ClusterAPI, which is a CNCF project, and as such, we to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Please be nice to each other. If you feel that you've been talking over, that you were talked over by someone else, please use the raise hand feature and we'll mute the other person so you can share your ideas. Thank you very much, and let's get this started. Hey, Matthew, thank you for joining. Mike,
Hello.
states.
Yeah. So we had a good discussion at the last Cluster API meeting, well, two Cluster API meetings ago. And I think this is going to be like a difficult, I think, as we know, this is going to be a difficult problem to solve, right? So my understanding from talking with the Cluster API maintainers, really, Fabrizio and Stefan have a lot of opinions about this. And like they would prefer to see the ignition bits being done closer to where the machine controllers are actually processing things, right? So currently, and this is where my lack of knowledge around ignition, this is where I need help to understand what can be done here. But currently, like cloud init is like the lingua franca for how we communicate what a node should look like. And what the preference would be to say, okay, could we remove the ignition fields that exist in the Bootstrap API type now and just leave the cloud init as like that's the spec, right? And then as a machine gets created, the machine controller in the specific provider will get the Bootstrap information. And at that point, that is where that's where Fabrizio thinks like that's where the ignition, transformation should happen and then get injected on that cloud. Now, I'm still reviewing the controllers and whatnot. I don't know, this is where I know that there's ignition works a little bit differently on every cloud, right? So there is some cloud specific part of this, but what I'm trying to understand is if we have a transpiler that can take cloud init and turn it into ignition, could we build a module then that the cloud providers who have ignition could update their machine controllers so that when a user creates a machine, if that user has chosen to use ignition through the infrastructure machine template, which is specific to the cloud provider, then the code will engage this library and it will transpile into ignition and it will change that, it will change the user data to use the ignition basically. So this is kind of my general understanding. Now, that doesn't give us like a centralized way to treat ignition, but it will allow us to target the various providers that we know have ignition support and want to be able to expose ignition. So we could create I think we could create a library that may even be able to exist in the Cluster API repo so that other providers can import it. And then we could identify specific providers that we know want to have ignition support, and we could work on getting ignition in those. And the V3 ignition stuff would go into the library then that would be used by the different providers. That's what I've been thinking so far from talking with them and kind of looking through things and whatnot. I don't know how that comports with what this group has been thinking, but yeah.
Matthew, any ideas?
Yeah, just to react to this, the ignition configuration is stored on the cloud provider like a cloud init configuration. So it's not up to the provider to know what cloud provider does support or not the ignition configuration, because we upload the ignition configuration in a similar way we upload the cloud init configuration here. So when the node is starting and ignition is starting, it knows what he has to do to fetch the configuration from the cloud provider. So yeah, that was just to establish the command base knowledge here. But yeah, honestly, I don't know what else to do with this and what to to reply to this. It seems like a good idea as well, but yeah, it's still on the implementation wise. I don't know how we can do that and how we can integrate this to the cluster API stuff
I would
without yeah.
I would say it's not the worst place to put this, just assuming this theoretical transpiler exists some point in the future. I think we have other changes that are image specific. So the other problem here is that Cluster API doesn't just hardwire assumptions about Cloud Init into basically the whole stack, but also assumptions about the node operating system in general, and the way the node is provisioned in general. I think the assumption that everything falls out of image builder is one that goes across the stack, and it's kind of like the same as with Cloud Init. So we kind of smashed our heads against that wall when we introduced system extension support, which is the preferred way of provisioning Flatcar with Cluster API and Kubernetes, because it's way more flexible and it's also way more secure because you get the latest bits and you don't depend on basically a post upstream publish step to rebuild some parts of the image. Now, this has engaged with the individual cloud providers already, like with the vendors, right? Because we need to fix up stuff afterwards, because all of these assumptions that just come down and honestly don't make sense in a world where the image is composed at provisioning time. Now, I believe that would be a premium spot to introduce that translation, and I don't see much friction in that at all. I don't think that's like a large problem.
What would be the large problem then?
I don't. The large problem is the elephant in the room is having that transpiler, right? That is something that doesn't exist yet and needs to be worked on. And then, I mean, having the subset of Cloud in it that is actually used by Cluster API as kind of definitive start of things, I think would be prudent in this situation. And then going from there, where that is exactly ingested in Cluster API doesn't really matter for this purpose, right?
So I'm trying to understand the image builder stuff. I think the workflow that right now, the workflow that the maintainers like would approve going into Cluster API core, right, would be if we say, okay, the core, the like the Cluster API kubeadm bootstrap provider, right? It still does what it does. It takes the input information and outputs the cloud init that comes out of kubeadm, right? So that happens the way it does normally. And as a machine is getting created, then there is this secret in the namespace that has like the cloud in it, right? And now the machine controller for the specific cloud is seeing a machine object and it says, I need to make a machine.
Yeah.
When it gets that machine object, it sees the bootstrap configuration, and presumably there will be some field, probably not in the bootstrap configuration, but probably more in the machine configuration that says, I want to use Ignition, I don't want to use Cloud in it. And at that point, yeah, go ahead.
Exactly, and this is one of the other angle where there's an assumption built straight across Cluster API is that there will always be the same image type at the end of the story, and that imposed massive amounts of pain back in the day where we introduced Flatcar because that assumption doesn't make any sense outside of Ubuntu. So it actually it's the other way, right? Like whatever, let's invent a theoretical image provider that you ingest. At the I don't know at what level it would make sense for Cluster API for that, to be honest. But so you're basically telling the system, I need these clusters to be composed of these nodes deriving from these operating systems. And then in that theoretical scenario, the operating system definition would tell you, yeah, that operating system speaks Ignition version 3. So then either the machine operator or some later part that's doing the operating system level fix-ups to clear all of the implicit assumptions that are coming down and just not true on the operating system level would take care of transpiling. It should be transparent to the upper level. There's no need for the upper level to actually know any of that. Unfortunately, parts of these are hardwired. And it should be a user choice, right? Like whoever does the provisioning should have a very easy way to inject into their cluster definition start. This is a flat car cluster. And from there onwards, everything can be derived from that.
That's a lot of business knowledge wrapped into the controller.
But I mean, I would not call it wrapping. I would call it making a sensible abstraction here, because we didn't previously, right? And that's how the whole Ignition stuff even ended up in ClusterAPI in the first place. So,
Well, right. But
and
this kind of goes back to like, do we want to write our own Bootstrap provider? Because I mean, I think the functionality you're talking about is tending back towards we want a different flow for this altogether. So it's like, do we want
not
a different?
necessarily. That would set us up against the way the upper levels of ClusterAPI work today. I
Right,
think it is way easier to kind of fix up stuff at the bottom end, at the machine end,
right,
where all of these definitions flow together and give the user a straightforward and easy way to say, I want this operating system, and everything else derives from that.
right,
I mean, yes, it's implicit knowledge up to a point, but I don't see a point exposing it. Like there would be,
right,
from my point of view, and I'm like as much on the user side and as far away from the developer side as you can imagine in the ClusterAPI world. From my point of view, I wouldn't want to deal with all of this detail as a user when I tell the system, make me a freaking Flatcar Kubernetes cluster. Then why would I need to be exposed to all of that? Of course, if I wanted to be exposed and do fine tuning, there should always be kind of a generic way of injecting my own configuration. But I don't want to overthink this at this point. So right now, I think nailing this down at the provider end and basically um, elaborating on the work that we're already doing on the provider end and doing to do all of these fix-ups of implicit assumptions that are coming down from levels that shouldn't really care about these assumptions, it is the better place to be. Because, as I said, we're already doing it. If it's one fix-up more, fine. Not much of a problem. The whole thing suffers from too much low-level business knowledge at the upper end of ClusterAPI. But I
right,
mean, that's something I would like to take this problem out of our critical path, because it doesn't really need to be there. It doesn't even, so the whole tackleability of that problem doesn't even suffer if we do things on the lower level, right?
right.
In fact, things get easier at the higher level. So that's why I think the whole like direction that we're taking is viable given the circumstances, right?
Yeah. So like I want to do a little more research and I'll write my thoughts into a document that we could discuss. But I think like if we can if we can build some sort of module that incorporates the knowledge we're talking about, right?
Mhm.
So that when a user creates their cluster, instead of like the cluster class doesn't need to know that it's going to be a flat car cluster, even though that would be convenient. But when they create the actual AWS templates or the Azure templates, they would say, this is a flat car cluster. And then as the concrete machine controller sees that machine, the module that we develop would be able to, we could say, okay, I see this is asking for a flat car cluster or whatever the field is, engages the library does the transpilation, whatever needs to happen, and
Yeah.
that injects itself into the machine creation. And then we could start with one provider whichever provider we think is the highest priority.
Hmm.
And we could create a pattern for putting this in, and then we could start to put it into other providers as we see, user demand or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Matthew, how does this sound to you? Or does it sound
Yeah, that sounds like a nice approach because we can experiment in a way with one given provider and let's open a pull request and try things.
Yeah.
I'm just a bit on the fence regarding the translation step because having working on these fields in the past, I know for sure that there is a lot of corner case you can't catch in the
Oh
unit
yeah,
test or whatever. So we
I
we
absolutely
have some
agree.
issues here.
The benefit of the environment that we're in would be that Cluster API uses cloud in a very narrow scope. Like they don't do exotic things, and also every use of cloud in Cluster API is reproducible because it's written in code. Like there's
Mm.
nothing injected from left and right that we need to take care of. And this way, if you can make it work once and it passes CI, then we should be good, at least, for the release that we're working on. So that's kind of the reassurance I get from this environment. I agree that in very general terms, a generic cloud init to butane transpiler had larger challenges.
And the second things I'm a bit afraid of, it's the code duplication. For example, we have flatcar templates for OpenStack, Azure, AWS, and so on and so forth. And every time we need to update this template, we need to update the templates on each cloud provider because it's basically code duplication on the template side. So if tomorrow we do this kind of implementation for one provider, let's say OpenStack, uh, and we want to change something on the other cloud providers, we need to open a lot of pull requests just to update this because it's split among the cloud providers. We don't have something common or central. That's
And
my
that
over
and
feedback.
that's a very good input. But I mean, the idea is to have something like a library that can be consumed by the cloud providers and handles basically everything. Whether that is the generic translation library or whether that is a wrapper that is Cluster API specific of the translation library, I think it's up for discussion. But and so Mike said previously that he assumes that there are some cloud provider specific things that Ignition does. It doesn't.
Yeah,
It
this
is
is why I mentioned that at the beginning of this
correct.
meeting.
Exactly. Ignition is cloud provider agnostic, up to and including where we actually recommend folks like poking around with Flatcar and learning Flatcar usage to write their Ignition configs, their Butane configs with a local QEMU setup. And then when they have their full-blown config ready, take literally the same config and throw it at AWS or OpenStack or wherever they want to operate, and it'll render the exact same node. So that's the beauty of this. And I think that has the opportunity of being very well abstracted.
Yeah, I think maybe I was thinking about the details of how Ignition gets injected into the instances. I thought that was different on each cloud.
That's already part of the implementation of the respective vendor, because the way Ignition is injected and the way CloudInit is injected is exactly the same way. So the
Okay.
vendors are already handling it.
Okay. So to what Matthew was saying, I think like I agree with you. I wouldn't want to see this, where we have like specific, code bits that need to be opened on PRs to everything. I think if we could build whatever the library is as a cluster API specific, library that gets utilized by the providers, and we could encode the business logic there for the different like templates or whatever needs to be different between the various providers, then it would just be a matter of like, updating the dependencies. So we wouldn't necessarily need to change code per se in the providers. We could just update the library to add new behavior that we need for
Mhm.
specific implement. And then we could centralize all the ignition based knowledge that needs to be, part of cluster API.
Yeah, so in this case, we need to be really precise and brings a lot of details in how we want to implement this library, because we want to have a strong contract, and we don't want to bring freedom in the way we use this library.
Right.
So
Right.
it has to be one line and just give some bytes and get some bytes in return, and that's it. No more stuff
Totally.
in between.
Like ideally, and I want to find this, I'm going to try to find this place in some of the cloud providers. So I'll write this up in the document. Ideally, there's a place in the cloud provider when the machine init where it says, here's the cloud init, and it just takes it and puts it into the user data or whatever, and then it boots the instance, right? So theoretically, we should be able to grab the code at that point and say, okay, take the cloud init, put it through this module, and then put the new output into the user data, and then
Yeah.
boot the instance, right? So hopefully, I agree with you. Hopefully, we can just get it down to the point where there's a very small section of code that you would have to change in the provider. And then I imagine we'll need an API update, which we could include in the module. And we could say, anyone who wants to use this, you can take this API piece and put it into your machine template. And that's where we can control if we need any sort of ignition options that people would need to put in. We could have an API, bit that could come from the library and be embedded into the API of the machine templates. At least I hope we could.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we need just to define a spec and some diagram here to know what would be the workflow on this. But yeah, I do agree on the stuff.
Okay. Yeah, give me some time to write this up, and I guess our next meeting is going to be right before KubeCon, right? So I don't know if I'll have it done right before KubeCon, but I'll start working on it and try to write this up, and then we could we could
How about we skip the next meeting and just meet at KubeCon in person, because Matthew will be there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And talk there.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, looks good, and we'll be at Rejects as well. Yeah, I don't know if
I
you plan to
already
attend Rejects.
tried, Mike, to get to Rejects.
I'm arriving on Saturday, and I do get there in the morning on Saturday, but I'll have to have a beer and see how I feel after that, and then maybe I'll come over to Rejects or something.
All right.
But yeah,
I'm
Alachek will be there as well, right? So we could all get together and kind of talk
exactly.
about it.
Yeah. That's cool. And we're still looking for. So we missed the GSOC opportunity actually. We're still looking for someone who wants to dive into that transpiler. Matthew has been looking for side quests lately, and that is an excellent side quest because it's so isolated, right? You don't have to touch any of the components. You have a very clear cloud init definition, YAML, and you have a very clear butane definition, also YAML. But yeah, if you know anyone who wants to jump on that, or if you folks had more luck with your GSOC applications, then yeah, I'm willing to help this person in and just ramp them up with whoever my team is knowledgeable about these things.
Okay. Yeah, I know a couple people who are always asking me for things to do, so I'll see if they're
nice. Oh.
I'll mention it to them if it's in their interest. Then yeah, I'll definitely direct them here, and maybe we could get them looking at it or something.
Oh, that sounds great.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll start working on this doc, and then hopefully when we get together at KubeCon, we can all just talk about it, and hopefully by then I'll have some code and some ideas of what it should look like.
Yeah, and then so just to conclude that thought experiment, that would require us to introduce yet another feature flag to ClusterAPI, which would be Flatcar but with Cloud init, right? Or could we just reuse whatever it is doing generically for Ubuntu and then at the machine layer decide, no, we actually want to use Flatcar?
Yeah, I think we could do it all at the machine layer. Like my hope is that we don't really need to change the core of ClusterAPI too much.
Yeah,
Like maybe we would put if the maintainers are okay with it, maybe we would put the ignition library in the ClusterAPI, repo so that it would be easy to consume by the providers. And then the provider, all the work will be on the provider end. So we just pick a provider we want to work with.
Yeah.
Maybe start with Azure or something and get it working there, or start with AWS or whatever makes the most sense, right?
I know that Matthew is a huge fan of OpenStack, so I definitely see
okay.
in this.
Yeah, for sure. Like I know a bunch of the OpenStack developers too. Like I used to work on OpenStack, so yeah, I love it as well.
All right. Yeah, I think two things to keep in mind, and we already have them in the meeting minutes. But since you're doing the write up, the first is the user needs a way to specify that they want a flat car node. Uh, and I leave it to you, like what granularity would make sense here, right? If we would need to support mixed clusters from the get-go, because if you do the decision at the machine level, we totally could, right? We could say, give
Yeah,
me these
right.
5 nodes of Ubuntu, give me these 10 nodes of Flatcar. So that's the first thing. How does the user decide that it will be Flatcar? And the second thing is there needs to be a way to, for the user, for advanced users, to side load butane configs or ignition configs that are run at one specific point, um, because that will come up. Like that always comes up, particularly with larger users. So we should have it in the picture from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, my thinking here, right, is probably whatever module we develop will have an API snippet in it, right? Like just an like a structured field that could contain any ignition things we need, right?
Hmm.
And then the provider, like cloud provider, like cluster API provider, OpenStack, right? They would import the module and they would add that API field to their machine template. So now
Hey,
there's like this
yeah.
API field. Then when the user creates a machine deployment that uses the OpenStack machine template, they would have the ability to fill out that ignition block, and that ignition block would contain whatever extra features we need to add. And it could be totally self-contained inside the module then, so that when the machine object is created, the concrete like OpenStack machine template
Mhm.
object, that field would be there, and the controller then can see it says, okay, the user has selected whatever operating system type. Maybe it's an ignition operating system type. Now we engage this extra module. It passes the API in, and yeah, it does whatever needs to be done there. If we can do it that way.
No, yeah, that's sensible.
Okay.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
I'll try to write this up then. Yes, it should be interesting. Hopefully it won't. I mean, I think this will probably make the core maintainers a little more happy. And then potentially we could just pull out the ignition stuff from the bootstrap, and that will make them even more happy. And then it'll
Yeah,
just work and they don't need to worry about this stuff at all. Cool. Sounds good.
perfect. All right. Yeah. See, we're not unhappy at all.
I'm glad. Yeah.
No, it makes, I mean, something I learned through Flatcar is that it is very important to hide complexity at the right abstraction level. Otherwise, things just explode.
Right. And I think that's what Fabrizio and Stefan are really worried about right now is
Mm,
that if we keep adding complexity to the top,
yeah,
it rolls downhill, right?
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Cool. No, I think we have a good path forward. Nice. Thanks for the good work.
yeah, well, hey, there's the real work's yet ahead, but I did talk internally to some I talked to some managers at Red Hat too. So like I know we were talking before about LHA and Timothy, kind of the work, the availability they have and everything. I've started to connect the dots inside of Red Hat so that like their managers know that I'm also taking a look at this. So
Yeah.
hopefully that'll help people be a little more on ease about, what we're doing and everything.
Have you talked to Clement?
I have not talked to Clement
Clement.
personally, but I asked my manager to to have a talk with him.
Nice. He reached out to me a number of times on Slack, and we were setting this up with uh, what was his name? Bipin and Alicia. And
Yeah.
so that's something that Clement basically initiated. He approached me,
Okay. Okay.
so he would be a good peer probably.
Yeah. Apparently, like my manager had worked with Clement a bunch in the past, so I was like, okay, why don't you talk to him and tell him I'm looking at this stuff too? So I'll probably get to talk to him at some point.
All right, then yeah. So the next meeting will be in person at KubeCon. Really looking forward to that. I'm there with the camp event, so if you're in for a barbecue, just tell me.
Nice. Yeah, always.
All right, folks. Yeah, thanks for the good work, and see you in 2 weeks.
Cool. Have a great
See
weekend.
you. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Bye.